It has some support, but it still is a bit controversial. These assets, of course, the bulk of which are stored in the EU, there isn't a complete agreement with just amongst leaders about how to deal with this and how to handle this. There's a genuine desire to support Ukraine. Of course, also on the table is a $50 billion loan that Ukraine could possibly use, and just wanting to increase military support for Ukraine more generally. But you can see that within the G7 leaders, there's just not complete agreement about how to handle this issue with the assets. And that illustrates further issues that they have in supporting Ukraine in the future.
Yes, I mean, the summit has been hosted by Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who is of the right, and the right has been strongly boosted in the recent EU elections. That in itself must be a bit, I guess, creating some tensions as they meet as to what might happen going forward.
Yes, it's been a really interesting result, the European parliamentary elections, where the center-right did the best, but it was an incredibly strong showing for far-right parties. So though they didn't win a majority, let's say, they won enough seats that they're going to be able to influence policy within the European Parliament. And so it was a huge win for Giorgia Meloni's party in particular. But she sort of built herself as a pragmatist. I mean, she's somewhat of a political chameleon in some ways, just at least the way she communicates. And she's decided that she wants to work with Brussels and has a fairly good working relationship with European Union leaders like Ursula von der Leyen. And she is supportive of the sanctions on Ukraine. Now, that's actually one of the big divisions within the far-right party family. You have parties like the AfD in Germany that are against the sanctions, and also like, Viktor Orban, Fidesz party. So many groups within the far right are against the sanctions on Ukraine and are very pro-Russia, just in even looking at their voting record. But thus far, at least amongst G7 leader Meloni, she has warmed up to Western leaders, and she keeps, as I mentioned, billing herself as a pragmatist that does want to stand up to Russia.
Interesting. When you look at the family photo that always happens at these meetings, we've got Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron. Of course, he won't be going anytime soon but he is facing parliamentary elections. So, whether these commitments are going to be honoured, whatever they come up with, could be fairly contentious.
Definitely, and I think that's one of the major issues as well, as there could be a commitment that they decide to agree upon, but then you've had a bunch of elections. I mean, one of the most notable ones, of course, besides the election coming up in France, but the U.S. election in November. And Donald Trump has a completely different vision for the world and is supportive of Putin if you just take him for his word. He admires Putin, admires dictatorships, is not supportive of NATO, is not supportive really of international institutions, regional institutions, and supportive of more individualistic stance or isolationist stance for the U.S. And that, of course, is going to motivate and galvanize Putin to take on more risks and to continue to press at a time when Europe and the U.S. And just all the countries in the G7 need to be more united than ever.
Yeah. Gaza, the conflict in Gaza, of course, remains such a pressure point. Will that be on the agenda, and how might there be pressure continued to be brought on both Israel and Hamas to reach some form of ceasefire?
Well, it continues to be an important issue on the agenda, and one where there are some divisions going on within Europe on this matter. You have the UN recently released through a commission a report that condemned both sides, that it condemned Israel for human rights violations and crimes against humanity, for attacking civilians, and for using massive types of weapons that could incur huge amounts of damage to civilians. And you also have them condemning Hamas for the seizure of hostages and their failure to release the hostages. So there are just so many complicated issues when it comes to the Israel-Gaza war. Of course, there are calls for a ceasefire and a return to the hostages, but we can't even get agreement on some of the details of every different type of peace agreement that is put forward, or at least ceasefire agreement that's put forward. And countries within the G7 have their own historical and different relationships with Israel that affect the way that they want to support Israel or condemn Israel, or support the Palestinians or condemn the Palestinians.
Yeah.
So it continues to be a complicated issue.
Natasha, of course, China is not among G7, but it is a pressure in not only their global assertions, particularly in our region, but, you know, to the imbalance of trade. How much will China weigh on these G7 leaders?
China continues to be a major issue, as is Russia, of course. China and Russia have attempted to forge a closer partnership. We don't have evidence whether or not China is sending direct military weapons to Russia, but they're certainly sending machine tools and semiconductors, which are dual-use weapons, which can enhance Russia's effort. But we've seen the breakdown, at least temporary breakdown, of an agreement between Russia and China for Russia to sell its gas and build a pipeline through China, so that would enable it to at least sell its gas to China, because they've taken huge losses by not being able to sell Russian gas to Europe. So I think there are eyes on what to do about China, what to do about the Russian-China relationship, and whether or not they can punish China for continuing to trade and support Russia. Yeah. How much is China willing to risk its relationships with Europe and the U.S. in order to support Russia, which, in terms of its alliance with Russia, there isn't really much that they share in common other than they want to stymie the rise of the West.
Yeah. Natasha, appreciate as always you going through some of those issues for us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.